change strategy and the communications needed to encourage Victorians to adopt recycling, waste minimisation and the avoidance of waste creation. And it's that research that David's going to very quickly walk us through so that we understand how to know your demographics, what those key messages were specifically in relation to recycling and waste minimisation behaviour. So David, welcome to our session today.
Thank you very much. And I must apologise, I have works going on behind me, so if people can hear drills and saws and that sort of thing, I apologise in advance. So yeah, today's presentation is very much around that behaviour change, but also campaign tracking research that we've done recently. So you'll probably recognise Wayne here from the Sustainability Victoria work that was done. So this presentation, what I'll be going through is looking at recycling practice, recycling knowledge, recycling attitudes, but specifically in relation to the groups that we know are quite hard to reach. Firstly, quite hard to reach, quite hard to influence, but also demonstrate lower levels of practice, lower levels of knowledge, lower levels of recycling attitudes. And that tends to be by age. Younger people tend to perform more poorly overall for all of those measures. Those in metropolitan areas, men, people who live in multi-unit dwellings or MUDs, those who speak languages other than English, so culturally and linguistically diverse or LOTE audiences. So all of these have been shown time and time again to come up in the research as showing lower levels of practice, knowledge, attitudes. So some of you would have seen these findings before, but I will go over them again very quickly, as Susan says, just to form the basis of ongoing discussions as to, all right, how do we think about talking to these groups? These are our target groups. How do we conceptualize them? How do we talk to them? The methodology, very briefly, it was a fairly long series of surveys. So the most recent iteration was tracking the Know Your Recycling campaign. So that was focusing on the last three in May, July and October to coincide with different parts of the campaign. But the survey itself has been running since 2019, June 2019. So we have a fair number of data points that we can look at both over time and then looking at those groups at each time point.
So David, just to interrupt, are you sharing your screen or hoping to share your screen with us?
I thought I was sharing my screen.
No, you're not at the moment.
Okay, let's try that again, shall we?
Yep, great.
There we go. Can people see my screen now?
We can indeed, thank you.
I spent so long on this presentation, I forgot to share my screen. You missed all the really good bits. So yeah, apologies for that. Starting up again. So yeah, going back to 2019, so a number of different implementations of the survey itself with a good sample size. So in each we had 1,000 people. That was split by male and female, roughly 50-50, three different age bands at about a third each, and then metro regional at about 70-30. So it's nice and representative. It's a good big sample, and we've got a lot of data points over time. Now I'm sharing my screen. It won't let me go to the next slide. Sorry about this. Now, there we go. All right, so I'll talk you through this chart because there's a fair amount going on. The first one is rates of incorrect recycling practice. So this is asking people, okay, what have you put in your recycling bin over the last, I think it was 3-month time frame. So if you ask all Victorians that, our data point at the top here, now it's going back a slide. All right, so at the top here is all Victorians. So if you ask all Victorians, have you put X, Y, and Z in your recycling bin? 53% will say, I've put something in my recycling bin that shouldn't have been in there. So it's a test of knowledge. So essentially, rate of incorrect recycling is around about half. That's not the end of the world, it's not great. But it just means that for at least 50% of the population, they're putting something in contaminating their bin. So looking down at the different groups that I mentioned before, metropolitan and regional, for this wave there wasn't actually a difference, although in other waves there is. Sometimes it comes out worse for metropolitan, so the bar indicates rates of incorrect recycling. Males always, without fail, come out worse than females. We're not sure why that is, but men always perform worse than females in terms of knowledge, practice, and so forth. Younger people, and particularly younger men, they tend to have much higher rates of incorrect recycling. Those who speak languages other than English at home tend to have worse rates of recycling practice. And those who live in multi-unit dwellings also have worse rates of incorrect recycling practice. So looking at it over time, what this shows is that it tends to bump up and down, but consistently since June 2018, all the way back there. Here's our orange bar here. This is all Victorians, and you can see that within that population, consistently over time, that males, younger, multi-unit dwellers, they have higher rates of incorrect recycling practice. So even though it's not always significant year on year, it's always higher. Very, very consistent finding. So knowledge, this is a slightly different question, though the outputs look very similar. We ask, is it okay to put X, Y, and Z in your recycling bin? So it's things that are correct, so cardboard, that can go in the bin, that's fine. And things that are incorrect, so for example, broken glass or thin plastics like plastic bags and so forth. So again, test of knowledge here. So this shows that if you ask all Victorians, can you put X, Y, and Z in your recycling bin, as opposed to have you done it, 73% will get at least one of them wrong. So that sounds high, but in fact the test is quite hard in that you need to get all of them absolutely correct. So this is an indicator of knowledge, but it is actually quite a hard test. So just to run through those groups again, metropolitan, higher than regional. They have lower knowledge of what can and can't go in their bins. Males perform worse than females. Age this time around did not show a significant difference. So if you look at 18 to 35 versus 56 or more, it's probably significantly different. Those who speak languages other than English at home, higher than those who speak English only at home. And for knowledge, there wasn't a difference for this wave for our multi-unit dwellers. So again, not all of these are significant this time round, but the same pattern just keeps coming up again and again, as you'll see here. So here's our all Victorians, so sort of ticking along there. And once again, you see the same thing, that metropolitan dwellers, males, culturally, linguistically diverse, they're always higher. They're not always significantly so, but they're always above that orange line. All right, attitudes towards recycling. So there's a big attitudinal bank in the questionnaire, which asks for positive and negative attitudes towards recycling. So things like, it is the responsibility of every individual to put the right items in the bin. Recycling is important to protect the environment in Victoria, and so forth. So what we find, again, very consistently year on year, is that if you ask all Victorians, they're very, very positive, generally, about recycling. They see it as a shared responsibility. It's an important thing to do. It's important for the environment. So these green bars here show agreement. The orange show disagreement. So with all of these very positive attitudes towards recycling, they tend to be very, very strong in terms of their agreement, and weak in their disagreement, until you get to the part where it says, I know exactly what goes in my recycling bin, and you start to get more people disagreeing with that. So there's some acknowledgement that people are a bit confused about what goes in the bin. But in terms of recycling as an important and a good thing to do, people generally agree. So what this table does is to take those positive statements I showed you before, it's the responsibility of every individual to put the right things in the bin, and it compares it by gender, men and women, age, young, mid, old, language. And so what you see here, not a lot of difference. These arrows indicate significantly higher or significantly lower. So if you look at the positive statements, you don't really see much by men, you don't really see much by language, but you do see a little bit by age in terms of difference. So younger Victorians tend to have a more negative attitude towards recycling, but not a lot of difference by other groups. So apart from this younger Victorian difference here, the positive attitudes towards recycling fairly consistent across the population. To the negative, so deliberately, the bank of statements is mixed up with positive and negative together. So things like, it's really hard to know what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to put in your bin and what you shouldn't. My recycling bin is too small. It's the recycling company's responsibility to remove non-recyclable items. So when you start getting into the negative type comments here, what you see is that people tend to disagree. The reverse of what we saw before. So again, it's just showing that overall positive attitude towards recycling in Victoria. But when you start looking at these negative attitudes by the demographics that I mentioned before, you start to see a lot more differences. There's a lot more little up and down arrows here showing you the higher or lower for different groups. So men, for example, tend to hold a lot more negative attitudes towards recycling. They are more likely than women to perceive that recycling is not worth it. It ends up in landfill. That it's the recycling company's responsibility to remove non-recyclable items. It's too hard to get the bin out on recycling night. So just generally more negative overall. Same with younger people, same difference that we had before, more negative attitudes, and some smaller differences here for English and call audiences. So fairly consistent for positive attitudes, but you get those differences by those key demographic groups for negative attitudes. And my presentation is really short because I get to hand over to other people to talk more specifically about younger and older Victorians, regional versus metro, men and women, multi-unit dwellers, called and loach. And I think the idea behind this is that to create an avatar, which is a phrase I learned just the other day, in that, okay, how do we think about these groups? If we're going to talk to them, if we're going to talk specifically to men or to younger men, what do the attitudes of this group look like? How do we talk to them to influence knowledge, which in turn influences behaviour, which in turn influences the outcomes that we're looking for, a reduction in contamination of recycling bins. So I'm not sure how we are for time. Were there any questions on my presentation before I hand over and other people can go into the detail?
That would be fantastic. I'd really love to encourage questions into the chat function, particularly of David while we've got him in the room. David's only going to be with us for another few minutes. Do you have any questions for David about what the data is showing and what it means for you and the target audiences you'll be going for? So please use the chat function. We'd love to see some questions coming up. And David, I might ask if you could stop sharing.
Stop sharing at this point? Yep, no worries. Hang on, there we go.
Thank you. Anything that you have that you really, while we've got David in the room and while we've got that research in the room, some of you may have seen that research. Oh, yes, Ian, really good question. When was this data collected, David?
Sure. Yep. So the most recent one was towards the end of last year. So this was in October 20.
Great. So that, you know, people have come out of lockdowns. They're still, you know, really, you know, being a bit more aware of what's going on around them, but it's in that late 2020. Abby has also said, thank you, David, that was really clear and good evidence. Some of you may have seen this in early December. Karen, it says, do you have any advice for individual councils about how to get their data out of the statewide data, especially if they can't afford their own research?
Yeah, yes, we can do that. We are, however, limited by sample size. So it's 1,000 overall, and if you start carving that up by smaller councils, for example, you're not going to get a lot of people. If you do have a request, we could pull the data out because we know which councils from the survey data. So if you have a particular thing that you're interested in, perhaps get in touch via Sustainability Victoria. We can see if we can answer your question, but just with the caveat that whatever sample size we pull, unless you're, say, City of Melbourne or City of John, it will be a relatively small number of people. And we have done ad hoc projects for some councils. Moreland, for example, I'm not sure if Kelly's on the call, but some have been able to afford their own surveys, and I understand that not every council can. So yeah, it is possible relatively inexpensively to do a survey within a council area if you did want to commission it outside of what's done by Sustainability Victoria.
Thank you. Any other questions for David? Karen?
Oh, well, if anyone else has got a question, but David, would you say that the data is applicable like to all of the state? Like would councils in regional Victoria and particularly rural councils have any confidence that they could say we have got the same target audiences or the specific challenge groups?
I would imagine so. Yeah, and the reason I say that is just it is so consistent. It doesn't really matter. So I mentioned Moreland before, for example. We found the same findings there. And that's obviously Moreland is going to be different to a small regional council. But in more recent work for Sustainability Victoria, where there's another larger survey that's been done, that's still in progress, we found the same thing over and over again. So unless you had a very unusual demographic profile in your council area, I would imagine it would be the same.
Actually, Bron asked quite a good question. Could it be split metro versus rural? Because, you know, they seem to have very different characteristics.
They do, yeah, and that's one of the findings that we keep finding, that metropolitan dwellers generally do better. So yeah, that was one of the findings throughout, that regional dwellers do tend to do better. That could be to do with the characteristics of regional Victoria. There are fewer multi-unit dwellings, for example, a different age profile as well. You know, all these things start to sort of tie in together. But yeah, certainly that metro, regional or rural split is apparent.
Well, David, I wonder if you've got anything on that rural data versus metro data, just as, you know, a capture, that would be so useful for the audience that we have today.
Yep, most definitely. I mean, yeah, you saw some of this in the presentation from before. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you there's a difference, and I can tell you where there's a difference. I can't necessarily tell you why there's a difference. I'm not sure what it is about regional or rural Victoria that makes it different, but they perform better. But I can certainly pull out some numbers if people are interested.
I'm incredibly biased. It's just because we're better people, I think.
Oh, that's right. A much better class of people. Yeah.
David, I want to thank you very much for that presentation. I know that you're particularly busy, and I'm really pleased that you were able to recap for us and set the scene. And we are now going to go on a choose your own adventure. So people will actually be able to say, what of this information matters to me, and how can I go to a workshop that's really going to give me more information for the campaigns I run. So my particular thanks to you, David, and thank you very much for being